You're listening to Head, a Star Wars podcast. Two fans, two generations, all things Star Wars begins now.
All right. Hello, everybody. I'm Eric Vansel.
And I'm Daryl Sanders.
And the hosts for, well, we're the hosts. We are the hosts of this show. So, and this would actually be a good time to apologize to everybody because I actually got sick over the weekend, and I'm still feeling the effects. I didn't go into work today or anything like that, and I'm like, all right, let's see how I do doing the show. So if I start going into a coughing fit, which of course I'll mute my mic, or if the energy's a little less than there, then you guys will know why. But we do have a really interesting topic to talk about tonight. And actually, it's funny because where this whole thing came from, this whole George Lucas returning to Star Wars, I had heard that it was based on, some like insider or somebody who's really credible who basically said it. And then I saw that Star Wars Theory did a video on it. What I didn't know, and that I came to find out, and then of course I actually watched the video that Theory made on it, was that he was actually interviewing a guy. He was one of the guys, I think he created the lightsaber design or something. He worked on the original trilogy and a lot of the prequels and stuff like that. He was a very well-placed guy. And when Theory was interviewing him, he just kind of let it, just really matter-of-factly, just said, yeah, well, there's this live-action series or whatever project, and, Lucas is going to come back for that or something to that effect. And, of course, Star Wars Theory was just like, whoa, well, okay, hold on, this is a little different. And then, of course, he had reported on it or talked about it or whatever. And then, of course, everybody else jumped on it because I was wondering where it came from. Because a lot of times this stuff pops up, it seems like, I don't know, at least once a year. You get the whole Lucas is returning to Star Wars thing, right? I mean, we know that it's been a thing, but I don't know, it felt different this time because usually it'd be one site. One site might report, oh, hey, he was on set and, he could return and, based on some very loose stuff. But this is the first time that we're actually getting any kind of report from a legitimate guy. And now multiple people are picking this up as a result, and now it's seeming like it's gaining steam. So that's pretty much what I had heard about it. What did you hear about it?
Basically, he's the same thing. He's Roger Christian, who's
that's his name.
Assistant director, unit director of the films. Yeah, and I mean, there's serious talks about him, although he can't put his hand on the Bible and have him swear that that's happening. It's just it's interesting, and it's funny that he has to kind of interview that he created, which I think is hilarious to me. However, Lucas, of course, we know he has been spotted on some sets, on The Mandalorian and some things like that. So it's not like he's just been completely absconsed from Star Wars completely. He's been around, and of course, there's been calls and things like that. Been a lot of shifts going on at Disney with Bob Iger returning back to Disney and things like that. And it seems like they're really trying to all right, we really have to pull Star Wars out of the muck and the mire that it's found itself in within the last 5 or so years. So it's very interesting. And even though it's George Lucas, we always talk about how much of a masterful storyteller he is and how he's done such a great job. I think that sometimes you're past your prime. Sometimes that can happen. So just because it's George doesn't necessarily mean that what he's coming up today would be good for today, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Especially with and then it's kind of hard sometimes because he also has to compete what's already been done. So maybe what his plans are would have been cool had he done them when he wanted to do it. But now since you have other content that's now considered canon, um, it's you have to now address that and stay within those framework and guidelines, much like how when Disney took over, they had to stay within sort of what he already established. So there's a lot of pieces here that could cause some conflict if he is to return.
Yeah, and I think that the thing that you got to look at too, and this is probably how we'll end up framing the discussion, I'm sure, is that one, how likely is it that he's going to return? Two,
Mm-hmm.
is it necessarily, a good thing or not? Because the way that I look at it, and again, it sort of goes along with what you're saying, everybody is crying for the return of George Lucas, but that wasn't the case when he made the prequels.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody was saying that he was destroying Star Wars, and in fact, there was a huge call for him to let it go and let other creators make movies or whatever. At the time, it was mostly movies, but TV shows were discussed too. Other content, basically. It's like, look, let somebody else try to do it. It's becoming too. It's just becoming from him now. Of course, you and I have said a long time in many, many shows that the sweet spot is probably letting him do the story and letting somebody else do the directing, kind of like Empire Strikes Back or even Return of the Jedi.
Mm-hmm.
People point to some of the battles and things like that in Return of the Jedi. That's where Lucas and David Prowse's relationship deteriorated. Of course, infamously, Richard Marquand and Lucas didn't get along at all, and there were problems there. But if you think about it, Return of the Jedi was still an amazing movie in spite of all the drama and everything on the set. So, as a result, I think that that's probably the sweet spot. But getting into this, I think, yeah, those are the sort of the things that we have to address and maybe look at some of the other things too that has been said or written about. And like you pointed out, where is Disney today? Where's Disney, Lucasfilm, Star Wars, I guess, today? That's probably the lens in which you have to look at this because, like you said, it's a very different Star Wars universe now than when Lucas sold it off. Now, I contend that he could just do his own thing, really. I mean, because one of the things that I've always said is, look, when people bring this up, and this is something I say all the time, is that, could he really make it worse? I mean, you know what I'm saying? It's like,
sadly, yes.
Well, maybe. Well, yeah, okay. So there was that one leaked.
So.
Oh, wait a minute. You're kind of you're freezing and chunking up. What was it that you said?
Mm-hmm. I'm like, yeah, I think so. I think he can.
Well, I mean, there was that one. So, and you and I think briefly addressed this on one of the last two shows. I don't remember which one it was, but we talked about how there were two different versions of what Lucas wanted to do for the sequel trilogy. The one was actually really cool. The one where Darth Maul was the main bad guy, and he had like Darth Talon, I think, was supposed to be like this female Sith assassin. And, Kira was like the Rey character, and Luke was training her and stuff. That was actually really cool. But then, what was the one that was just recently talked about? Where I remember you ended up even texting me after sending it to me and saying, man, it's a good thing that he wasn't making this or...
Oh, yeah. It was basically like he wanted to talk about the whole stormtrooper thing.
The stormtrooper thing, yeah. Which
Yeah,
that could have been interesting, but again, it would have depended on how they handled it. Because that's where
I
I
think
think,
that would have been cool for a live action TV show, but
yes.
maybe not a movie.
Well, maybe not the sequel trilogy, especially.
Exactly.
Yeah, I agree. I think that if they did a show, and yeah, maybe that's what this is. You know, it's funny that that little plot synopsis or whatever came out around the same time as now they're talking about a Lucas-led live action show. You know, I mean, does carry a little bit of weight.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, when we're talking about, um, George coming back, right? So, one, it depends on in what capacity are we talking about. Are we talking about film? Or are we just talking about a live action show like Ahsoka, Book of Boba Fett, Mandalorian, things of that nature? I think, as we often say, the heart of it has to be the story, and then followed by the execution of things.
Hmm.
Now we know that, like you aforementioned this about how people were calling for him to get out of there when he created the prequels, and the stories were good. And I think that, but the execution of it wasn't done right. So I think more people over time, especially with the blunder of the sequels, had a chance to look at the prequels again. It's like, you know what? The story of this is actually good. And I've always thought that. I've always thought the story of it was good. I just thought that maybe, and I get like Phantom Menace was like, okay, we're talking about trade and all this crap. And it's like, okay, well, but you have to set up the war, though. You have to set up what all this is about. So I get why, we kind of had to suffer. It's no different than when you see some of the movies, and it's like, okay, you kind of have to suffer through the origin story, but just to get to the good part. So now when you do everything after that, um, you can really get into the meat of things. So for George coming back once again, I think creating something new in Star Wars will be interesting because so far we've only known him really to carry out the Skywalker saga. He did the original trilogy. All right, we were talking about Luke and Vader, and then he went back and told the story of Anakin in the beginning of the Clone Wars and everything like that that led up to the budding of the Empire. All right, so now if he's to take a character, because now the place that he has to go now is either create something brand new with characters we've never heard of or never seen before, like, well, I can't even say that, or use things that's already existing. Now I'm curious to know from you, Eric, because I think that he should either do High Republic or the Ray story. The question is, which era do you think he would be best in? Picking up from where he left off, or still further going back to explaining everything that came before?
Well, the logical thing, honestly, would be that Coruscant Underworld series that he had completed 100 episodes of, at least from the writing perspective.
Okay, so you're not going with either one. You're just going with what he
Well,
already
I'm
came up
just
with.
yeah, I'm just saying that if the rumors and everything is true that he's really coming back,
Hmm.
because that was a huge pet project of his.
Yeah.
You know, like I said, he had finished. I mean, obviously there was nothing in production. He had some animatronics. He had like some conceptual things that people could visualize, so that way, the production team could start working on things. But
Hmm.
honestly, he had written 100 episodes of it, and it seems like if he was going to come back in and do something, that would be the thing to do. Now, whether he would do something, I don't think he would do anything in the sequel trilogy universe, because he really wasn't a fan of the sequel trilogy, and I can't see him wanting anything to do with that, especially because he didn't create any of those characters. You know, Lucas is not the type of guy that's gonna take pre-existing characters when he's the one that created the thing. I mean, he was equally critical of the expanded universe, and the expanded universe was well loved by fans, and he himself said that the writing and, you know, all that stuff was good, but again, wasn't his vision. You know, when fans would press on him, you know, he would say, well, yeah, okay, it's good. I'm not saying it's not good, it's just not mine. Now, he did throw the fans a bone a little bit by obviously taking some things from the expanded universe and canonizing them in his own, you know, his own projects. But Lucas is very much all about, my vision is the vision. So he's certainly not gonna, I mean, anybody that thinks that he's gonna pick up from the High Republic, or, you know, any of these things that were not his creation, that's just not gonna happen. What Lucas is going to do is he's going to ignore all that stuff, and he's going to do his own thing. Now, he could create a new, because you're right, I mean, with the Skywalker saga, you don't necessarily have to be tied to even which era is it, because you could go to any era and say, well, what's going on in a completely different part of the galaxy? Now, it would be kind of tough during the Skywalker saga, simply because the galaxy was in such turmoil. I mean, even the Unknown Regions knew who the Empire was, and they knew who Anakin Skywalker was. I mean, they had heard of these people. But again, that's according to canon and expanded universe writers. You know, that's not necessarily Lucas's thing. So it makes sense to me that if he's coming back in, and they specifically said in that interview there was a live action project, which tells me that it's a series, and that Coruscant Underworld thing was a series, and it was his, and he could probably tell that without messing with the current canon too much. That's what that's my money.
Okay. I think that's very viable. And I think that would be okay. I think that would be good. But now you could do, so how much control do you think Lucas would have? Because they're still talking about, like, okay, him coming back, like, so in what capacity would you, this is so tough, because, like, what capacity do you put George Lucas in now?
Well, that
Because you
was
gave
brought up,
Filoni the whole creative.
the director thing, but that was brought up by Star Wars Theory in the interview, and I agree with his assessment 100%. I mean, Lucas, if somebody tries to say to Lucas, like if Kathleen Kennedy comes up while he's doing something and she's like, you know, George, that's not really the direction we want to go, he'll just walk. You know, if Lucas is willing to come back, first of all, he knows, because he's seen, I mean, he's alluded to the fact that they've destroyed his creation too. If you read between the lines, and sometimes not so between the lines, when he called Disney white slavers and all that other stuff, you know, he's definitely not happy with what they've done. Now, he likes certain things. I know he liked the Mandalorian thing. I know he likes Andor. There are certain projects that he likes. And of course, Filoni, obviously, he would work with him. But Lucas knows as well as anybody, if they're entertaining the idea of bringing him back, they know it's in case of emergency break glass. They know that, look, you need me more than I need you. Lucas has his billions. You know, why would he subject himself to fan scrutiny and all this other stuff when he could just continue going away in the sunset and doing his thing? And there's even some project I remember he was talking about working on with his wife or something. They're gonna, I don't remember, it was build something or open something. I don't know. I remember reading the article not too long ago, maybe within the last week. Lucas doesn't really need Star Wars, and he doesn't need the hassle of Star Wars. So I'm sure that if he was brought back in and he agreed to do a project, his first thing would just be like, listen, I'm the guy. None of you would even have jobs if it wasn't for me coming up with this stuff. So here's how it's going to go. I'm going to do my project. You're going to leave me alone. You're going to release it. You're going to thank God every day that I agreed to come back, and that's how it's going to roll. I mean, and that's probably pretty much how he would put it. Just throw that in legalese in a contract, and I think that you're there.
No, I don't doubt that at all. I think you're absolutely correct. And yeah, I mean, he does have that. I mean, he's like the ultimate, source. I mean, because we've always said none of this will happen without him. He is Star Wars because it came from him. So yeah, so do you think that we need him back?
Yes, and I think that one of the things, proverbially speaking, he does have the high ground in this case. He has the advantage, and I do think that we probably could use him back because here's what I think could happen. You would get a Lucas project. Let's just assume that he makes it and it becomes the triumphant return to Star Wars that everybody hopes and thinks it would be.
Mm-hmm.
Now, whether people like it or not, it depends. I mean, because if you even look at the prequel trilogy, yeah, a lot of people complain about the directing, the execution, the acting, some of the stuff that we all know by now, right?
Yeah.
But nobody ever said it didn't really feel like Star Wars. I mean, yes, there was the complaint of the too much green screen work, but essentially the Star Wars vibe was there. It just wasn't at the level of the original trilogy, and that was the biggest complaint. But, it's been a minute, and now that we've seen how low it can actually go, now if you bring Lucas back and it feels like the Star Wars that we all knew and loved, and it becomes successful, well, what happens now is it's the antidote to all this like woke agenda stuff that they keep trying to bring into it. So I definitely think that they need to do it because where Star Wars is going, and I've often said this, it's like, well, if you thought it was bad, recently, wait till you see where this stuff is going. I mean, they're really going to run this franchise into the ground with all the social commentary they're trying to put in, with just artificially trying to make billion-dollar movies rather than make good movies. I mean, I just think that it's something that we need, that pure Star Wars storytelling back. And the difference is that now Filoni is around to kind of help guide that too, and he's more experienced than he was when Lucas last worked with him. You can almost I was just about to say that. Now I am the master, and you could make that argument actually that that's the case. Now,
you're master of animation.
Exactly.
That would be George's response.
That would be George's response, but I definitely think that that's right up there. Now, Dragonfly says, I think if he comes back, it'd be to help develop Yoda, Yaddle, and Grogu species in the planet. That's another interesting take, although I don't necessarily see that happening. Well, there's only one way that I would see that happening, and that's if the storytelling demanded it and Lucas agreed with it, because his big stipulation in the contract when he sold Lucasfilm to Disney was that they were not allowed to reveal Yoda's species or anything like that. That was actually part of the contract. There's no way in the world I could see Lucas now coming in and go, yeah, I think we're going to do, I'm going to reveal all this. Because if that was a big, sticky point to actually put that in a contract, for a sale.
Mm-hmm.
Now, could
That's
he have changed his
$1 billion.
right? Sure, he could have changed his mind, and maybe, maybe after seeing the Mandalorian or something, maybe he sees some potential. I don't know. I don't know.
Well, I think with that, I think his only thing is because that's such a revered character for him, much like how Ahsoka was for Filoni. I think it's
Exactly.
like if anyone wants to do it, he wants to do it. Like I'm not entrusting anyone to do that character. If anyone's going to do it, it's going to be me.
That could be.
So I think he's more or less protecting that character so that like in moments like this, like if he wanted to do it, he has the freedom and the authority to do what he wants with that character because that's his guy. No different than, like I said, how Ahsoka was with Filoni.
No, that's a good point actually, and they could. That's something they could bring Lucas back in to do. I don't necessarily think that that's going to happen right away, but the other thing that we can look at too is okay. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that the Coruscant Underworld series is what he's brought back in to do.
Mm-hmm.
It would be a weird move. I mean, the whole thing is kind of weird timing, but again, Disney's losing investors right and left. There's talk of selling the company, not Lucasfilm, but Disney. So they're really in trouble over there. So I'm sure they're entertaining everything. Well, let's just say, for the sake of argument, that's the case.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing you got to look at too is that I don't think it would be a one and done with him. I mean, you bring him in, he does a project, especially if it is successful, then they're going to be like, hey, what's next?
Well, yeah, I think so. I like the Yoda question. Do you think that if George came back, what do you say if George comes back and he says, "Hey, I'm going to do a standalone Yoda movie"? I think just the character alone would drive people to the theaters because they will probably say, "Hey, I gotta see this," because he's like I've said before, he's one of those revered characters, right up there with Palpatine.
Mm-hmm.
However, to know that it's George Lucas telling the story, he's holding the reins to this, as opposed to a Filoni or a Favreau or anyone else. You know that literally the master is coming back to deliver another master to the world. I think that will put butts in the seats just alone.
Yeah, it would, but you have to remember that his motivation has never been about putting butts in seats.
True. No, I know. But I think it's a story that everyone wants to know. And I think he's the only one who can tell it. And that alone, like, I think what I'm saying is like, okay, George gets to do another magnum opus with Star Wars again, with a character that no one else is able to do. And that's something fulfilling for him. What's
But it's
fulfilling
not,
for
though.
Disney will be the money that comes with it, though.
Yeah, but I mean, it isn't. Look, you're talking about a guy who wanted to make an entire trilogy now about remnant stormtroopers. His mind doesn't work the way ours does. That's the thing. It's got to be something he would want to tell. Lucas is not going to come back just to save their butts, telling stories that the fans want. I mean, he's never been about that. He's always gone against seemingly what the fans want. It's just that once we get what it is, we're like, all right, that's cool. But then there's a lot of things where we're like, I don't know, man. And that's why I say storytelling versus a direction, that's the sweet spot. You get somebody else to direct it. Now, you add Filoni into the mix, that could be that liaison that really helps, because Filoni can speak George's language and he can also speak Disney's language. And so I think if you had Filoni in his ear going, hey, a Yoda story would probably be a good idea because of X, Y, and Z, then I think that there's a chance that Lucas would go ahead and do it. But he's not Lucas doesn't feel motivated to tell Yoda's story. As far as he's concerned, he has told Yoda's story as far as what he wants people to know.
Mm-hmm. True. I can see that as well.
That's why I think that the biggest shot, if it's true, is he's already got this 100 episode Coruscant Underworld series somewhat in the can. I could see that being the project that they bring out. And I can also further see it because, like I said earlier, you could do that in such a way, even if it had to be rewritten slightly, you could do that in such a way that it wouldn't necessarily screw around with the canon they've already got, even though they've been really hammering that in between episode 3 and 4 lately. But, the universe is big enough. He could tell the underworld, at least on Coruscant, hasn't been touched that much. You had that one story arc in the 7th season of Clone Wars where Ahsoka was with those two sisters. That's really the extent. I mean, you've had things here and there. That whole what was that game called? Like 12-12 or something. That one that was supposed to be the game based on the Underworld, which was in turn somewhat based on Lucas's series. And honestly, seeing the animatronic versions or whatever that Lucas had put out, or I should say Disney put out, just kind of like, hey, this was, and you could find it on YouTube if you want to see what the series would have looked like under George's vision. It actually was pretty compelling. Like, I was bummed that never got made. So, and he was really attached to that. So I think that could definitely be something that would be a really good, hey, we'll bring you in, you could do this. I think fans would really like it. It would have that Lucas storytelling touch and the production. I don't know. I think that, and that's why it goes back to what you said earlier, where do you think it's needed? And for that, I absolutely think that yes. And we needed to counteract a lot of the SJW stuff and the agendas and all that some of these people are trying to bring to it. But more importantly, even aside from all that, even before all that was brought into it, goes back to what you said not too long ago. Masterful storytelling needs to come back to the franchise, Yeah. And that's the way to do it.
I mean, don't get me wrong. Like, I think the Underworld is a phenomenal idea because it does touch on the area that we are aware of that's ripe with loads of characters that you can, explore and you can spin off from there. Plus, I think you can kind of almost cover every group and it makes it, you give everyone something. So I think you will have people like smugglers. You have bounty hunters. You will have wayward Jedi who are kicked out of, not kicked out of order, but like have left and or went into hiding. They'll be around.
Right.
You will have all these different types of things. Of course, all these different compelling stories, how their lives may intersect with different stuff, especially when we're looking at series now that kind of have somewhat of a darker tone, and that will be, or a CD type of thing that people kind of already like. Game of Thrones was darker. You had Stranger Things, darker. You have what's that show? Euphoria, dark. You have so many. I mean, even Cobra Kai has its light and dark moments. So I think when you have a series like that, it could give a lot of the action packed type vibe for people who want the action, but I think it also will provide a lot of drama because like people love crime dramas, people love stuff like Law and Order and things like that. So you bring a lot of that type of atmosphere, not necessarily like a legal type thing, but you have something where it's more crime driven, such as like a Power or BMF or any of the other mobster type movies that you see. that's prevalent on these streaming platforms, that opens up uh, a world of stuff. And I think that's kind of what people wanted the Book of Boba Fett to be,
That's
because the
exactly what
Book
they
of
wanted it
Boba,
to be.
and that's what they, and we didn't get that, and so we got half the season him floating around in his little hyperbaric swim tank, and him flashing back to everything. So if you put something in there like that, I think that would really go a long way with fans, because I think everybody can probably find characters that they would like. Because quite frankly, that would be a perfect time to see like Hondo. Like I could see Hondo popping up in that series all the time, and you know how much I love Hondo.
Well, and
So
you could do that. You could bring in Clone Wars characters. You could. I mean, I remember from what I saw, I was actually struck by how dark it was. Because
mhm,
every time they always say, well, okay, like a seedy underworld kind of thing, you're like, all right, whatever. But then even just seeing it, again, in a really crude animated form, they were just like test shots, basically. It was pretty much like a proof of concept. That's
right.
essentially what that was. And I was really struck by how dark and just how menacing the whole thing was. I didn't really think that Lucas would create something like that, but he really did, and he basically was saying that, look, this is one I'm not making for kids. And you could tell just by that whole thing. In fact, I remember when he basically made the deal to sell it all to Disney, I was bummed because I'm like, man, that means we're not going to get that series now. And I was
Mhm.
really looking forward to that series, especially considering how good Clone Wars was. So I figured, all right, this is going to really knock it out of the park. And again, that would have been the first live action Star Wars project. And in a way, I feel kind of bad
Mhm.
because, that was taken away from him. The Mandalorian became the first. Let me
Yeah.
see. We got Ted chatting here. He says, I agree with all you're saying. George is a great architect, and then it's good to have someone else execute. Pair him with Favreau or Dallas
Bryce
Bryce
Dallas
Howard.
Howard.
Yeah, Bryce Dallas Howard. Um, directing, and we will have a great addition. I keep meaning to expand the character count on these chats. So that's a good point. Is that you could sort of do what he did with Kirshner and Marquand, but now do Bryce Dallas Howard or Favreau, or even though we
Mhm.
just did last Monday, we talked about, and that's why this is kind of an interesting juxtaposition too. By the way, I have to
Yeah.
point out that this show that we're doing tonight is a result of your votes. Um, we put a couple of topic ideas out, and you guys voted for this one. Actually, I have to disclose, it was a 50-50 tie, but the comments are what swung it. And now there was after I had basically made the announcement, another vote came in. So it was actually 56% for this topic, 44% for the other one. The other one will get made. But it was like, which one do you guys want to see first? And essentially, it worked out because last week we talked about Favreau leaving Star Wars, and now we're talking about Lucas returning to Star Wars. And it really doesn't necessarily have to be a guy that has already been in the Star Wars universe, right? I mean, it could be somebody maybe that we haven't seen,
Yeah.
you know? I mean, it could
Oh, no,
be.
I'm just saying like a character like Hondo is what I'm saying. Like you
No,
have
I'm
these
not talking
different
about
types.
Hondo. I'm talking about directors.
Oh, okay. That's what you're saying. Got you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I wouldn't mind seeing Hondo direct a film, but
Yeah. Of course, my friend.
yeah, exactly. Find out he's like some dude that he was based on. But I mean, I think that really when you stop and think about it, there are more positives than negatives for Lucas coming back. I mean, what would you
Yeah.
say are some of the negatives? Like if you had to come up, like if somebody brought it to you and you wanted to play devil's advocate, because obviously you're in favor of it too, but
Mhm.
let's just say that you were going to represent the group that might not want him to come back. What
The
reasons would you
prosecution.
give? Yeah, exactly.
We the people. No, I think that one, he hasn't done this in a while.
That's a
And
good point.
so it's been a long time since he's even, written. I mean, I'm sure he probably still writes stuff, but to be in the mind frame that this is actually like it's going to go into production. That's a whole different thing. You might write stuff just for your own hobby or for fun and just like, oh, I had an idea. This would be kind of cool. But you're not thinking of like, okay, this is never going to get made. This is just for my own personal enjoyment. So there's that. There's understand. I can't say that George, because that's the interesting thing about George. George doesn't write for fans. He writes for himself, and then fans just happen to like it. So I can't necessarily say like, you know, he might write something that fans just aren't into just because it's his thing. And, you know, there's not too many, I mean, don't get me wrong, at the time in which he was creating and he was in that creative space, he gave us Star Wars, he gave us Indiana Jones. Sure.
Yeah, but he
Red
also gave us Howard
Tails.
the Duck.
Yeah, no one really remembers that or
No,
cares.
but I
No
mean,
one.
that's the biggest. That's still known, other than like Ishtar, as one of the biggest flops and one of the worst movies of all time. Still makes the list.
Yeah,
Nobody, people remember that was. I'm talking about in the
terrible.
sense of romanticizing,
Oh,
Lucas.
George Lucas. Yeah.
Yeah,
Now, now, don't get me wrong. Like Red Tails, I don't know necessarily if that was completely his because it is based off the Tuskegee Airmen. So that's kind of a hard. I, you know,
yeah, but you have to
I
tell
don't.
the story, and sometimes it's even harder to tell a real story because it's like, well, where do you start? What do you include? How do you tell the story? I mean, the fact that he told that compelling of a story, especially because that came right around the time of the prequels, I think. Wasn't that the thing that he did
Mm,
like right after, or like I think it was
yeah,
the
right
next,
after. I think right
like right
after, I
after
believe.
Revenge of the
Yeah,
Sith. Yeah.
yeah.
It was amazing because you're like, well, you can make this. Why didn't you? Where was this for the other ones,
Well, but see, and that's what I'm saying. Like, I think because you're dealing with events that has already happened, so you're
Yeah, but
not
think
having to.
about this. Those are events that happen. This is stuff that he actually made up in his head.
Right, but when you make up something in your head, you know how sometimes it seems it's better in your head than when it comes out.
Mm.
It's just like when you say stuff like, "Oh, I thought that was clever and witty in my head," until you say it, and I'm like, "Yeah, that kind of sounded stupid." It's one of those type of things. Whereas something that's factual information that we know transpired, it's like, now, how do I just convey this in a way that people can relate or it would touch people, or what perspective of this can I give people who may have heard this story? It's no different than like a preacher who reads a story out of the Bible. We've heard Noah's Ark for like eons, but if you tell it from a different perspective, almost like, oh well, what about the other people, or maybe from the perspective of his wife? Okay, well, how does she deal with the whole concept of being on an ark with all these animals? That's a unique experience. And I think that's what made Red Tails um, so good. Um, but other things that, as far as, and that's what I mean, like George hasn't done a whole lot of filmmaking or things that were successful. He just had two really big franchises that happened to really just knock it out of the park. So even he himself,
Is that all?
yeah, essentially, because it's not like there was a Red Tails 2. So I
No, but I
mean,
mean, what I'm getting at is, though, that's
yeah,
that's something that every filmmaker dreams and almost no one achieves.
true. I mean, and
So
that's what I'm saying. That's what makes it, and that's what I'm saying, and that's what I'm saying about George. He's lightning in a bottle. my thing is, and it quite frankly, they happen roughly around the same time.
Yeah, that's true. And
That
so your
time period, and
your
that's what I'm
concern
saying.
is this creative period, but I'll tell you why I don't think that that's
Mhm.
necessarily an issue, because the interviews and things that I've seen recently where he talks about Star Wars, and I mean there was one in particular that where Christopher Nolan interviewed him about filmmaking, and they were going back and forth and stuff, and
Mhm.
you just listen to him and go, man, this is just such filmmaking wisdom right here. I mean, you don't lose that. I mean, all the technical innovations that he's made, all the stuff, it's
Mhm.
because he understands storytelling and movie making so well. And I don't necessarily think that just because he's been out of the game for a little bit, because if you think about it, there was a pretty good chunk between the original trilogy and the prequels too. And of course, people could point to, well, obviously, because, you know, look at what
Mhm.
the prequels became. But a lot of that problem, I think, comes from Lucas being more enamored with the technology.
Absolutely.
Maybe it was almost like he had too much available to him, and I think that that's why not so much the storytelling, but the execution suffered quite a bit. Was
He
because
just got blinded by
he got
the
yeah.
he was blinded by the possibilities
Mm-hmm.
versus keeping his, well, in the words of the prequel, since we're talking about that, be mindful of the present, but not the expense of the moment.
Yep.
Or the future. Be mindful of the future, but not the expense of the moment. And so I think
Mm,
he was looking at the future as, oh, I could do this and this, and I have this ability now to tell these type of stories. However, because you're so focused on that, you're not paying attention to like what really got you there.
yeah.
But once again, though, it's the familiar for him though. When we're talking about the prequels, yeah, don't get me wrong. Like and I said it earlier, the stories for the prequels were great, and but once again, it's only because it's his thing. It's something that he created, and I know that's kind of like part of like, well, that's what we're talking about, like him coming back to his own thing. However, it's still kind of like, all right, a lot of people, I would say it still hinges on, can you still tell the type of stories that people would care about? And that's always the sticky point. Um, and I guess some things can be looked at subjectively, whereas people, like I think you said this on the last episode, Eric, which I think was a very poignant statement, that you can not like something and it still be good. You just
Right.
didn't like it,
Yep.
you know. And so to that moment, yeah. I mean, it's kind of hard, but those are the two things I would really hang my hat on. Is that the fact that he hasn't done this in a while, and did his, and coupled with that, when he was doing it, like I said, with Indiana Jones, Star Wars, you're talking about 70s, mid 80s. Okay, that's those days have been long gone. So now, I mean, granted, you did have Red Tails, but once again, Red Tails was information that you just kind of assimilated and put out there. But to come up with something fresh and new that's compelling, um, in this climate, uh, I don't know. I hope so,
Well,
but
I I don't think that that's an issue, only because, like I said, even interviews that he's given within the past 6 months or something, and it is strange that he's doing more and more as far as that goes. You're hearing
hmm
more and more, but you're talking about a guy that just understands storytelling practically better than anybody else out there. You know, he really gets it. Now, that doesn't necessarily guarantee that he's going to make a good film every time, but it does mean that he understands it to the degree that he could tell it in I don't think he's going to necessarily be what am I looking for here? It's not going to affect him, I don't think, like it would other filmmakers. You know what I mean? Like, let's say the time period, right? Oh, telling modern stories or stories in this era, you know, where it's kind of like, okay, sure, you could tell them back in the 70s, 80s, even 90s or whatever, but we're in a different time, blah, blah. Because one of the things that Lucas masters is the ability to tell timeless stories.
Yeah.
And that's an art form that not a lot of people have.
Yeah, and also his compelling characters. You know, like, even though Harrison Ford played both Han Solo and Indiana Jones, they're two completely different type of people.
Yep.
And they were written that way. And of course, with Indiana Jones, Spielberg brought the best out of Harrison Ford in that, so that really shone through. However, it's still like a feather in the cap of George to show that, like, hey, you know, I can take the same person that you fell in love with in this type of setting where you first meet him as, you know, this cocky, you know, pilot. And then I could take that same person and put him in a fedora and, you know, give him a bullwhip and make him this kind of adventurous, but yet smart and, you know, I mean, there is some Han Solo in there. You definitely see, like,
Right, but
some
I
of the
get what you're saying,
sarcasm,
though.
but it's portrayed differently.
Completely different character, yeah.
A completely different character.
And that is a good point, because that was, I mean, honestly, Indiana Jones, the first one, the Raiders of the Lost Ark movie, it came out like a year after Empire Strikes Back. So we were firmly entrenched with you know, Han Solo. I mean, if you think about it, I don't know if that's ever been done before. Maybe in the world of Marvel, but I don't really think that it has been, where you get this guy who is a definitive part of this one franchise. Now he's part of this other franchise, and it becomes arguably as bigger, you know, that character than the original one. I mean, if you really stop and think about it, you're right. Lucas actually did a completely different thing. Now, granted, he had Steven Spielberg there too, directing and and helping, and I think that that's the reason why the Indiana Jones franchise was as successful as it was. It's because you had Lucas doing the storytelling and all that, and then Spielberg executing it and, you know, maybe punching it up, revamping it, whatever. And Lucas wrote it and produced it.
Yeah, the only character that comes to mind that's close to it in my mind would be Robert Downey Jr. doing Iron Man and then also Sherlock Holmes.
Yes. However, although that is a good comparison, there's a couple of things that I would say is different. Number one, the Sherlock Holmes franchise, while it's big, isn't as big.
You talking about as big as Marvel?
Well, as Marvel, or even if you talk about the Star Wars versus the Indiana Jones thing.
No, I'm just comparing just as far as like.
But I mean, no, it's a valid.
Seeing the characters being complete, you know, almost roughly around the same time. That's all I'm saying. Right,
and that is true. That is, and that's why I said, you know, probably Marvel, because all those Marvel guys have done other things. And the Sherlock Holmes thing is a franchise, so it counts. But I also think that part of it, and this is the only reason why I would give a little distinction, is because one, Sherlock Holmes is a literary character. So it wasn't like creating another franchise character.
True.
That's a big difference, and that's a big deal, because Lucas managed to create another full character and franchise that got just as big in some ways, if not bigger, in pop culture. So that would be
Valid.
one distinction that I would make. And then, of course, the other one is that, it was pretty much right after you establish this one, you come up with the other, which you could say that with Sherlock Holmes because, again, I think the first Sherlock Holmes came out like right around the time of the first Iron Man movie. Because the first Iron Man movie is like '07. Sherlock Holmes was in there somewhere. I don't remember. But yeah, that would be the only big difference that I would make is it's a different kind of a deal. But, I mean, it is true, though, because, you could... And, of course, the other big difference, I would say, is that Robert Downey Jr. was a well-established actor. Now, granted, Iron Man was what brought his career back from the dead. There is that. But it wasn't like Harrison Ford where he was a relative newcomer. Star Wars was really only like the second real thing he had done. And then Indiana Jones, like, right after that. So... yeah, I mean, that's interesting, and I am really curious to see, how any of that would work, because a lot of this is predicated on the fact, too, that Lucas would want to come into, like, somebody else's thing.
Yeah.
It's almost like, it's like your wife leaves you for another dude and then comes back to you. It's... I mean, basically, now Lucas has to come back to Star Wars with all this additional baggage, all these things that he didn't create, basically like this blasphemous, for him. I mean, granted, he was still operating in the sense of the expanded universe, but it's a little bit different because he still had control over that. This, I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I guess we'll have to kind of really wait and see what comes out of this. See what if there's any more further development, and if he is to come back, what's going to be his role, or what is he going to do? What's his first project?
Yeah, yeah.
And then how much control is he going to have? Will he finally be able to shut Kathleen Kennedy up? All those things.
Well, that would be nice. That would be good.
If he just came back and did that, I mean, quite frankly, his job is done, in my opinion. But
honestly, if you were going to come back, I wish you would just take the company back. That would be like, I mean, that's because think about it. He's selling his company off, and now he's going back to work for the company. It's kind of weird. He's like an employee of a company that bears his name. It's...
yeah.
I don't know how any of that would work.
Literally called Lucasfilm.
Yeah. And that's the thing. I mean, I would just wonder, on one hand, I would think that he would be motivated because it's like, look, these guys have run this into the ground. If I have any chance to maybe right the ship, I should probably take it. On the other hand, it seems like it just expose him to all kinds of other scrutiny and, toxic fans and all this other stuff.
Yep.
So I just don't know if he'd want to deal with that, quite frankly. But we'll have to see. But anyway, let us know what you guys think about this whole thing in the comments. And thing I want to know, and maybe I'll put this up as a poll or something, because I'm really into doing that now. What you think his first project will be. You can comment it in the comments below. You could take the inevitable poll that I'm going to put up shortly after we're done. Let us know, because we want to hear from you guys. It's funny because somebody, I don't remember which person said it. Somebody was like, oh, you should just get Star Wars Theory on this show. I'm like, yeah, like that's going to happen. I mean,
yeah,
but you never know, right? So maybe what I'll do is I'll send him, a link to one of the episodes, or maybe this episode, or I don't know, something, and see if he'd want to come on and talk about it, because it would be fascinating to talk about it with him, especially since it was basically him that more or less originated this thing. So we'll see. But anyway, the plan is this Friday. Obviously, we got the final episode of The Bad Batch, the series finale, also the season finale. So You know, we'll have to see where this is going to go. It's fun. I've been talking to some people in the comments about it, about how we, you know, even now we don't really know where it's going to go. So we're going to have to check it out. We're going to have to see what's going to happen Friday at 11. It's our plan to, you know, I always have to say that now. That's why I really suggest not only that you guys like the video and subscribe to the video, but you might want to hit that notification bell, because the way the schedule has been, you're going to want to be notified when we go live if you guys enjoy watching live and chatting. Of course, I always post it on social media, so you guys will have a heads up. If you sign up for our Head-to-Head of Star Wars community on Facebook especially, you can go to our Head-to-Head Star Wars podcast Facebook page. All of our social media is at Head-to-Head SW. I don't actually usually promote that enough. I should promote that more. But until then, I'm Eric Vansel.
I'm Daryl Sanders.
May the Force be with you.
Always.
Head to Head, a Star Wars podcast. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at HeadToHeadSW. Submit your questions for our next show. Visit our official website at headtoheadswpodcast.com. Until next time, may the Force be with you, always.